on.
Just a reminder, slowly.
Clearly, I thought
No local idioms, so that people understand you.
I'll try my best.
Great. Okay. Lovely. Fantastic. Yes. No. Absolutely. Yes. Speaking in French accent.
No, I said excuse my French.
Different type of Jay, I sent out the survey message first. Is there anything you want to change to that message?
I must have missed it.
This is what it looks like, but I'm about to send it out for the second session. Is there anything you want to modify, change?
No, that's great. 30 seconds surveys already. Thank you.
And how tight are we on time for the session?
So we're supposed to start at 10:40.
Yeah.
We're probably going to be starting closer to 10:50.
Yeah.
So that's probably going to shave off 5 minutes or so we can trickle 5 minutes into the next session.
Okay.
So roughly the same that we gave you. I think it was 1 moment, I'll confirm. Next session.
Well, don't get to wait to the end to say that. Way too early.
So you guys, the next session starts at 11:40.
Okay.
It's probably going to be more like 5. You're going to roughly have probably 15 minutes.
Okay. We'll try and be done in 40 and 10 minutes.
Yeah, you might get
So it's best with a question in an interactive way, right? So we could speed us towards the end, so maybe it's best with questions.
If they're coming.
It's kind of an experiment too,
Yeah.
He wrote you into this. How nice.
And I said I'm going to do it on this week.
Really? And you bought me drinks last night. I mean, it's just like, it's got me chill.
I haven't seen it yet in the bar. But this could change.
Thank you both again. Appreciate it.
I think it's good to do these sessions. I think it's really good. Although there's going to be a lot of information.
But compared to having one hour,
Yes. Yeah.
nothing. I mean, nothing substantial to a full day. I think it's good.
And? How are you?
George, yes, are you pretending to be a newcomer?
No, we actually want to organize an idea thing, so see how
And I saw Barry and Lee was in the audience as well. It's like,
yeah, but Chinese was in general, like you're playing.
I feel like if we have a meeting in China, it's translated. Like we did this in Japan one year, where I think we did a We're going to get started in just 1 minute.
I need to be high for me and be right high for you, Benoit.
Bob, do you see Jay in the audience or no? I can't tell if he's over here.
Yes, he is. Just let me know where it's going. Yeah. Or do you want to?
Which one? Okay.
In terms of where? Do you,
Okay, are we ready?
ready?
Want to go look? Laura's going to do a quick look to tell people we're getting started. So. Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is session 3. We're going to be talking about standards development. If you haven't already, go ahead and practice scanning that QR code so that you can record your attendance in this session. Give you 10 more seconds.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's go.
Is it working?
Yes. So this next session is on basically the standards development process. And you've already had quite a lot of information today that's come to you, and you're going to have a lot more that comes to you as well. So you got 2 for the price of 1 today. You've got Benoit and myself. We'll introduce ourselves in a moment. And we're going to talk you through basically how you go through producing a standard. What are the steps that you go through? What are the key steps? And there's lots of information on these slides, and we'll talk around them as well. We won't talk just over the slides as well. So you may want to come back and read them as you go through. I'd be worth saying that we're welcome to take questions as we go along. And if you do so, you sort of queue up the mic line if you want to do that, or you can take questions at the end. Is the clicker working? Yes. So I'm Rob Wilton. I've been doing this game within IETF for about 10 years. So that's when I started participating. Before that, I had another about 10 to 15 years in the industry. So I was already reasonably really experienced when I first came to the IETF. And I spent about 5 years producing and working on standards. And then I spent 4 years in one of the leadership teams, the IESG, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then I went back, stopped being in the ISG to being like a standard participant in the IETF. And then more recently, I've now become a working group chair for the Green Working Group. And my favorite topics and things like ops and management and network management. Benoit, do you want to introduce yourself?
So good morning. My name is Benoit. I joined the IETF in 2001. The first time I joined, I was completely scared because I had to present in front of people who kind of invented the internet. But the goal of this session is just to explain how it works, so that whenever you have to present, you know the rules, you know the process, and we're going to make it easy for you. After that, I put my finger into the IETF and my arm was gone. So I had multiple roles like chairs and IESG, etc. And I still enjoy it.
Thank you. No, next slide. Oh, the note well. So you'll get to come and know and love the note well very well. So in every session, the note well is presented. I think it was presented earlier on and talked about through the note well. Obviously, this meeting is an IETF meeting, and it means that anything you say at the mic line, anything that happens this meeting, is a contribution to the IETF. And it's always worth understanding what that means, what the rules are, and particularly the IPR rules. But given we've done it earlier, we won't wait to the slide. Right, so I'm going to sort of spend some time talking about working groups and areas. And effectively, this is the part of the IETF that produces the standards. So there's little different areas of the IETF, but the core part that Benoit and I have been most involved in is the bit that produces the standards, the RFCs that you all sort of might sort of know and read and love. And I'll start talking through the various areas that we split it out. So IETF is split into different areas to try and group common technology areas into the same sort of places. So we have 7 different areas today. They sort of come and go over time in terms of what their structure is and what working groups get assigned to them. So sometimes they change. They change relatively slowly. So the WIT area at the bottom there was introduced a year ago. So that was created by merging 2 other areas where it made sense that the balance of work wasn't quite even. So they split the work out and tried to align different technologies areas together. So just sort of running through them, you'll see there's 7 areas here. Each of them roughly has 2 area directors, 2 people in charge of that area. And they're responsible for sort of helping move the work along in that area and managing the working groups in that area. The exception to that is that this Gen area, which is sort of an unusual one. The Gen area is the one that does like IETF process. So that's the area that the IETF chair is responsible for. He's the only AD responsible for it. And that area likes to sort of work on how the IETF processes, so the RFCs that define the IETF standards process, like RFC 2026, for example. All the other ones, the other 6 areas, actually sort of do technical work, and they drive technical work through the IETF, and they produce RFCs. And just to sort of summarize what they are, at the top we have the art area, applications of real time. So layer 7 in the OSI stack would be what you'd think of here. And in terms of applications, well, anything can be an application. So it has to be an application that's relevant to the IETF or the IETF wants to work on. Examples might be mail or instant messaging has been there in the past and it's sort of come back. And also it sort of picks up a lot of sort of little small bits of work that don't necessarily find another home but are interested in the IETF. And then the other side of the art area, the real time, is real-time communication. So like WebRTC, which is what we're using to stream this video, or voice over IP, for example. All those sorts of telephony type protocols also come into the art area. The int area responsible for the sort of layer 3 works. That's the core bit where you think of the internet and IP and IPv6. So that's the int area. They also pick up a few other things to do with DHCP and mobility, but it's really the core part of that area is anything to do with layer 3 and the internet protocol itself. Ops management, that's the best area to work in by far, because both of us were ops ADs. And actually this is an interesting area because it's split into 2 parts. Each has 2 ADs. One AD is responsible for operations and the other AD is responsible for management. All the other areas, the ADs sort of share the roles. They have different working groups they're responsible for, but they both, like all the routing ADs are all routing ADs. The ops management area is sort of 2 smaller areas put together. So both Benoit and I were in network management, and there's a separate ops AD who's responsible for ops operations. And this area covers network management, telemetry protocols, data modeling for the network management side, and the operations side is like a cross-cutting area where it's like the operational aspects of all protocols that the IETF is interested in. So they have working groups covering like V6 operations or multicast operations or segment routing operations and things like that. So these ops area working groups sort of span across and have deployment of all these things. And then the other one that ops area picks up that's very big is these are DNS protocol as well. Routing area. Does all the signaling protocols and things like all the routing protocols all come to there. So anything like BGP and ISIS and loads of other ones, effectively, it's a large area in terms of not necessarily the number of working groups, but the amount of work that goes through there. So correspondingly, it has 3 ADs to handle the workload rather than 2. Security area, again, is another cross-cutting area where it sort of considers all the security aspects across all protocols effectively. And in particular, it's like the key exchange and privacy, security, encryption. A little bit of this work is done in IRTF as well, the research part of the ITF. And finally, web and transport is one that's newly created. And the transport is obviously layer 4. So TCP, UDP, and the new one, Quick, is the popular one that's in there that's sort of pulling in new work. And then the other side that they pulled in recently was all the HTTP and web traffic sort of over that, and web APIs and things. Anything related to doing APIs over HTTP comes into the WIT area. Next slide, please. It's stuck. While we're moving slides, so each of these areas has working groups associated with it, and they have between, I don't know, maybe 10 and 15 or maybe 10 and 20 working groups to each area. The particular working groups don't necessarily make that much, you won't know them from their names. They choose sort of quite clever little acronym names for them. And the best way to sort of find out what working groups you might be interested in is to go ahead and read the charters of the working groups effectively. So one thing that is worth saying is that each of these areas sort of has a sort of more general working group that covers area-like issues or where new work comes into that area. So like dispatch is under the art one, is where new work comes in. Gen dispatch is where new process work comes in. Int area, ops AWG, RTDWG, sec dispatch, and TSVWG are all sort of similar. They're either area working groups that span across the protocols or where new work comes in. But as I said before, the key thing to here is understand what's in the charter for those working groups, and you can read that on the data tracker, which Benoit's going to talk to you about.
So on the next slide. So who knows about the data tracker? Okay, very good. So whenever you arrive at the IETF, you want to basically go to a specific working group. In here, we're going to analyze a couple of fields in the data tracker. So let's assume that you want to go to this ACE, Authentication and Authorization for Constrained Environment, right? Rob was mentioning the acronym. We try to find an acronym that makes sense, not the specific acronym for the name of the working group. Now, what else? In the tracker, you will see what it contains, right? What is the topic of interest that you want to join? You will also see the responsible area director, right? You will see also the chairs in there. You will see it come from security. Remember the previous slide? If you care about security, that's maybe where you want to start. Look at all the different working groups. What else? If you want to join a meeting, you click on meetings, you will see IETF 122, or maybe some interim meetings. And from there, you will see the agenda, the presentation, and everything else. Sometimes we have a secretary, which is also mentioned here in my glasses. How to subscribe the mailing list? That's the way to do it here. The archive, everything is happening on the mailing list. So whenever we take a decision here, we need to confirm it on the mailing list. And this is how to browse the archive. What am I missing? I think this is almost all information. Yeah, so let's go to the next slide. And now in the list of documents on this tab, who has been writing an IETF draft already? Very good. What's the difference between those and your working group document? Whenever you see draft-IETF-working group name, it means it's a working group document. Your document initially, even if you target a specific working group, doesn't belong to the working group, right? So you need to call it whatever name you want, but not draft-IETF-working group name. So let's say you want to participate into this working group. First, you read the charter. That's what you want to do. Second thing, you look at the different documents there. and maybe you have feedback. So sometimes we see the question, how can I participate to the mailing list, to the IETF? First thing, start by reviewing the documents and provide the feedback on the mailing list. That's a good way. You will see also the status exists. Obviously, it's a working document, right? Because we have draft-IETF-workgroup name. And whenever the document will evolve, we'll see the process. You will see that this one, for example, is in the RFC editor queue, which means that the working group did its job, review it, is going to be published. So that's a way to get an overview of what a working group, what a charter is working on. Next slide. If you click on a specific document, right? Okay, title, the version. If you post a new version, you have to put a +1 here in the revision. Now, look at this. We've got this document by those author. And remember, this one is an individual draft. It doesn't contain draft-IETF-ACE. And you could see quickly the revisions. So somehow it gives you a kind of view of the maturity of the document and since how long we've been working on such a document. So it was an individual document starting in July 23. It was moved 2 years after to a working document. And then there are a couple of interesting pointers. The one I preferred is HTMLized, where you could see quickly the diff between two documents. So if you are up to date with a document and there's a new version, I quickly review the diffs to see if there is something that I approve, disapprove, like, don't like, I want to give feedback on, etc. On the next slide, and I think this is your turn. By the way, any questions, feel free, right? It's an interactive session.
So I'm going to carry on in terms of the same theme that Benoit's been talking about to talk through this sort of standards process. What are the key steps and how do these go through? So, right, yes. So the process flow, we talked about this in a bit more detail as we go on, but there's like 3 key phases to any document. And the first phase of that is that individual draft. And that's what Benoit was talking about. Anyone can post an individual draft to IETF and it will turn up on data tracker and you'll see it under a working group. If you name it in a way that targets it to a working group, you'll see it under the list of documents of interest to that working group. But it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that the IETF has any interest in the document because anyone can post it. It just means here's a document I want other people in the IETF to look at and potentially read. So you start off with having an ID, you write your individual draft dash and your name, and then some description of the documents, and then you post it to the working group, and the working group data tracker sees it. But you also send an email to the working group and say, hey, I've written a new document on this. Could you review it and give me feedback? And you have a sort of a few rounds of feedback and discussions, things hopefully in the mailing list. Hopefully you come to the IETF either in person or remote, and you ask the chairs before the meeting, you say, look, can I present my new work? And if there's time on the agenda, and the working groups will focus their time initially on the working group items, the things that have been adopted, but there's extra time spare, then there's an opportunity to present your new work there. And then you do that for a few sessions and things, you get feedback, you update your document after that, and you get to a stage where you think, okay, I've sort of made progress here. And the working group also has a feeling for whether they're interested in this work or not. They may say, I don't like this work, I don't think we should do it. Or it might be it's not in charter or something else. But you ask the chairs, you say, I would like the working group to adopt this work. And the working group chairs now move into that second phase. So the working group chairs decide whether they think there's a reasonable chance this document is in a state where it might be adopted. So they might write back to say, no, you need to work a bit further, a bit harder before we try and do an adoption poll. But at some point, the chairs will say, okay, fine, we will ask the working group whether or not we should adopt this document. And this is the first case where you get one of these consensus checks happening within the IETF. So the working group chairs will ask the working group participants, they'll have 2 weeks to to review the document, which hopefully they've already read it before, but to give comments on whether or not the working group should pick up that work and it's of interest to the working group, and whether people will help review it and comment on it. At the end of that 2-week period, different people will give back feedback. Some people say, yes, I support this adoption. There might be some people that say, no, I don't support it. And hopefully they'll give reasons as to why. I don't think we should do this for this reason. And then there's a chance potentially to address that feedback or not. And the working group chairs will make a decision as to whether the consensus is, yes, this should be adopted as a working group. This should become an item of work that the working group actually actively wants to work on and is interested in. And at that stage, it subtly changes. If it's adopted, it's no longer under the ownership of the authors. They still keep their copyright and things, but the work now becomes ownership under that working group. So the name of the draft changes from draft-author and then the name of the working group to draft-IETF. And at this point, it's possible for the working group to assign new editors to the document or new authors. It's a working group item, although often, in many cases, you keep the same authors and the same editors who wrote the original documents. But the working group can change it. It's now become part of the IETF process. So once you get to that stage, the document then has more cycles going around, more meetings where it's presented, and it's got almost guaranteed time to be presented on the agenda. If it's being updated, it's now a higher priority item, and if it's in charter for the working group. And you'll go through multiple revisions as people post comments on there. And eventually you get to a stage where you think you're done. So you're not getting any further comments on the document. There's no sort of contentious issues. Either those contentious issues have been resolved, or you got to a point where you got to like a stalemate case where you don't really know what the resolution is. And at that point, you then say to the chairs, look, I think I'm done with this document. I think we got as far as we're going to go. And you do a working group last call. And that's the second sort of consensus point check that happens on this process. And where, again, the chairs will ask the working group for 2 weeks to review and provide their final comments on the document. And it might be, I've read this document and I support it because you've been working actively. It might be, I've read this document, I think it should be published, but I've got a few comments on things. Or it might be, I think this document's on the right track, but actually I think there's a lot of comments in here. I think it needs another revision. So you get all this sorts of feedback comes back in, and the authors will be addressing it and responding to it as it comes in. And at the end of that working group last call period, which may run over more than 2 weeks, but there's 2 weeks deadline in terms of getting feedback in, the chairs then have to make a consensus call as to whether consensus has been reached, rough consensus has been reached on that document. And if it has, then the working group chairs can then say they'll do a shepherd review. So they'll ask somebody to check that everything's been done correctly on the document in terms of all the crossing the T's and dotting the I's, getting the process correct. And then they'll move it on to the next stage, which is passing on to the IESG. And at that point, logically, the working group is sort of done with the work. And you see a phase in terms of the documents where the working group's been proactively developing a document, and now that phase is finished and moves on to the IESG. And this has multiple steps. And the first one is that the area director for that working group will review the document and check that they are happy to publish it. So they will look at it and say, yes, I agree that this document is something that I will put my name to, we should publish this. The area director might say, actually, no, I don't think we can publish this document because it doesn't cover these aspects, or it's not quite in the charter. Hopefully that would have been picked up earlier, or for whatever reason, the area director can choose not to publish a document, although that's very rare. Normally, if that was going to occur, they would stop that much earlier in the process. So the area director reviews it, and once they're happy, then they put it out for last call to the whole of IETF. And that's the third sort of consensus checkpoint. And that's where it goes out to everyone has ability, even people who aren't in that working group have the opportunity to review that document over a 2-week period. And it's the same sort of comments come back, although nowadays that IETF last call generally is very quiet other than directorate reviews, which we'll talk about later. Once that's all finished, then it goes into ISG review, and the ISG will review the document. If the area director thinks it has consensus, they do another round of balloting and voting, which we talk about in a bit more details. And either they feed it back to, they need some more changes to the document and it might go back to the working group, or otherwise, if it's only minor changes or small changes that get made to the document, then it's like the IESG will say, yes, this document is done. and it's sort of ticked off as like, yes, the ISG has consensus, the IETF has consensus document, and then the final stage is it sits in the RFC editor queue for an RFC editor to pick it up. They do some sort of tweak the English and improve it, but don't change the meaning of the protocol, don't change the technical aspects, and finally gets published as an RFC maybe a month or two later. And that covers the sort of core process. This is on to you, Benoit.
So the unofficial mantra of the IETF is we reject king, president, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code, which is why we've got the hackathon during the weekend. So humming, who knows what humming is? Okay, so let's play a game here. Let's pretend that we've got a difficult choice to decide whether or not we come back to Bangkok. So maybe I'll give a show of hand. Who wants to come back to Bangkok? Who doesn't want to come back to Bangkok? So now I've seen who has been voting. I could be influencing the people in my direction. What we're doing with humming is basically doing and we're going to redo it with humming. And we'll see who wants to come back to Bangkok. Who doesn't want to come back to Bangkok? All right. Now, this is actually good. I don't know who has been voting. When I entered the room, there was a discussion, do we represent our company or individual? We are individuals. It happens sometimes that I believe something is the right thing to do, but maybe not what my company wants to do. So I have the freedom to just hum as I want. And we don't see who has been humming. I mean, I cannot see except maybe for you, right? Now, humming is the beginning. I get the sense of the room. Now, what we're going to do is ask, is there any specific reason why we should not be coming to Bangkok? So the person who were against it, they have the freedom to come to the mic and say, well, Bangkok was unreachable for people from my country or any issue. And if it's a valid issue, it does not mean that because we hum in favor, we're automatically going to come back to Bangkok, because the only person who hummed against it might have a pretty valid reason to not to come back to Bangkok. Now, Bangkok is an easy example, right? But if we say this protocol is going to have encryption algorithm 1 or 2, the implications are a little bit more consequential, right? So this is why we like to do humming. Now, the humming, as I stressed, this is the beginning to get a sense of the room. We should be hearing if there are any valid reason not to go in a direction. One thing I want to mention is that we've been humming a lot in the IETF now with COVID and with more and more people being remote. It's a little bit difficult. How do we hum and we are virtual? You know, if you do the hum again and I do in the mic, we will, I will destroy the consensus because my voice is louder. So that's why we start to see sometime voting with the tool in the data tracker whenever we present. Anything you want to add to this?
The only thing I was going to add is, even though we do the voting in the data tracker, it's not taken as a pure vote. It's taken as an indication of the leaning of the room. So just because you get 10 votes to 8 doesn't mean that you're going to say, well, we're going to go down that choice. If it was maybe 18 to 2, you'd say, okay, there's strong consensus in that direction. But when it's sort of marginal and things like that, you say, well, actually, maybe we need to tease out and find out why the consensus is sort of marginal.
Very good. So typically, we do the humming at the beginning to get the sense of the room. Then sometime I do it after, because we heard all of the arguments and we want to understand if the sense of the room has changed. And then I'm asking the question, is there any argument in favor or against that we have not heard about? Because it's not the point to rehash the same arguments. At some point in time, we need to decide encryption 1 or 2. So on the next slide. All right, so Rob discussed a lot about the process. So let's try to address this like you have a document, you have an individual draft, you want to advertise it, you want to discuss it in a mailing list, you want to make not noise about it, but you want to have people react, telling you, I believe this is a bad idea. I believe we had this idea in the past, it failed. I believe this is a great idea. And you want to get people discussing about your idea. As work group chairs, there is sometimes we receive requests to have presentation time. And the draft was barely posted to the mailing list, and there was no discussions at all. What does it tell us? It tells us that maybe there is not enough interest. So if we have to give priority to a different presentation, well, maybe we know there is interest for second one, so your draft will not be presented. So submit your draft in the right working group. We checked how to look at the tracker to find the right working group, then discuss it verbally on the mailing list. Now, something I want to stress always is that many people just come to the IETF to push their ideas. I think it goes in both directions. Whenever you're a newcomer, feel free to comment on the draft from the others. As a consequence, they're going to provide feedback to you. It's like a win-win. It's going to be a good citizen. Now, Rob mentioned what's happening. The chair decided there's interest. We do a call for adoption. It becomes a workgroup document, etc., etc. So for the rest, you described it already. So yeah. The different working groups might be working differently. Everything is on the mailing list, this is for sure. Every decision, even in a meeting, will be confirmed on the mailing list. But some might be using GitHub to even track the action item for the document. Some have their document in GitHub, which is easy if you want to have a small diff, right? So we don't impose any way of working. So if you join a new working group, see how they work. Mailing list, sending a message is always a good idea. If you want to do it on GitHub as well, feel free. Whenever you are a document editor and you just approve, like just click in GitHub and you've got the next version. Now, different working groups might be working differently. We might be having interim meetings. So let's say that there is a hot topic. Do we come back to Bangkok or not? Maybe you want to dedicate an interim meeting specifically on this. There is simply a 2 weeks advance notice, and it's a virtual meeting. It might even be physical. So this interim meeting will be discussing a specific topic or series of topics. The different working group might be working differently. Some of them have a secretary who's helping with getting the presentation, tracking the author, posting the documents, and all this. So from the people who have been having an individual draft here, something you have to know. Let's assume your ID is great, there is support, it becomes a working document. Now, here is the thing. Whenever the document is accepted, this document belongs to the working group. It means that even if you are the editor and you are pushing all of your ideas, now it's based on the consensus of the working group that changes are brought in. And it might happen that the document is going to drift a little bit because it belongs to the working group. And something that the chairs could be doing is also assigning editors, which might not be you or you in connection with someone else, right? Typically, if we don't foresee any problems, the primary authors are going, or the set of authors are going to be the editors anyway, right? And one last thing our group could be doing is that, Bangkok or not, it's difficult to decide right now. So let's have a design team. They're going to meet however they want, weekly meetings, virtual meetings, and they're going to come back with a set of recommendation for the working group. That's also something that you could be doing. And those design teams, they're open, right? It's not, nothing is closed in the IETF. That's something I like about it. And this is here the list of interim meetings that we've got. And if you come to the IETF 122 data tracker meeting, you will see something like this. I want to attend a meeting. So starting tomorrow, you guys will be attending meetings, right? You will see one line like this. And all these small items here are resources that are useful to get in the calendar. There is, with all the documents there is one for the meeting minutes. We take meeting minutes online. It's also interesting. Let's say you went to the microphone in a working group and your feedback was not correctly captured. You can go online directly and say, you're not going to change what you said, right? But maybe you're going to clarify. So this is also something interesting. In this case, it's for interim meeting, but it's the same interface for meetings. So typically we had like an NMOP meeting in February this year, focusing on template, whatever it is. But if you care about this NMOP working group, you would be notified on the mailing list that there is this interim meeting. Okay, so it might be interesting also for your individual draft to, if there is like a specific interim meeting on this. We're good in terms of time?
We're doing okay. I think we need to.
Okay, next slide. This for you.
Right. So I talked through some of this process already. So we talked about, Benoit's covered what happens when the document's going through the working group. And then as I mentioned earlier in the overall process, you have these three phases: individual draft, working group document, and then it moves on to the ISG. And I've covered sort of the key parts of this ISG part of the flow, but there's a couple of things I want to pull out. One is that you get these directorate reviews that happen. Now, the directorates are groups of experts that work in a particular area, and their job is really to help the area directors. The area directors end up with so many documents to review that they need to have some help for getting other people to review the documents as well, to give them some feedback as to whether there's any issues they need to look at and understand. So when a document has either goes for working group last call, or sometimes the working group chairs will ask, or sometimes the ADs will request them, you get these directorate reviews, but they count like any other review happening during the working group last call process. And you take the feedback on like any other feedback you receive, and the area directors take it on the same way as any other feedback, and then they move on. So in terms of the process in the ISG, we have this working group last call, you have these directorate reviews, then the area director decides it's ready, the ISG ballots on it, and I'll talk about balloting in a bit more details in a moment, and then either it gets approved or occasionally gets sent back to the working group if serious work needs to be done on the document. There's some serious issue that occurs. So the ISG balloting, so this is always one of those mystery things, and it's always one of those areas that ends up being quite scary for newcomers, because they see the ISG as very senior within the IETF, and they have a lot of power in terms of what they do with these documents, because they have the right to stop any document from being published. So if you spent 2 years on your documents and suddenly gets this last stage, and the ISG says, or a member of the ISG says, actually, I don't think we should publish this document for some reason. So that can be quite nerve-wracking, and it's sometimes hard to understand how serious the comments are in terms of the documents coming back. And what they try to do is split it into sort of 2 key categories here. One is called a discuss, and the other one is a comment. So a discuss on a document is a blocking position by an area director. So they're saying, you have to make these changes, or even you have to discuss these issues, and I have to be happy with this before I'll approve this document and allow it to go ahead. And basically, it's not quite the case, but basically any area director that's holding a discussed document can stop it being published. And the area directors use these to try and sort of either say, there's these bits of the document that are particularly unclear, bearing in mind that the area directors are all normally reading this document for the first time, other than the area director who owns it in that working group. And so they have a different perspective on it, and they're all experts in that particular area of that technology. So they're there to help the authors and help the people produce good documents that cover all the aspects. So the security area directors might say, your document's great, your protocol's great, but you're missing these security considerations. What happens in this case? Is there a hole here that's a security problem? And if they find one, they'll put discuss on the document to say, you need to address this. And it's not saying the document has to be sent back. It's just this issue is serious enough that I can't allow the document to go ahead and be published until this is addressed. So you get these discusses, and then you have to work with the area directors and resolve them. And then the other sort of comment you get from area directors is just a comment. And every area director is spending 2 or 3 days every other week reviewing these documents. So they spend quite a lot of time. And as they notice issues and things, they'll either put some discusses on the document or they'll add comments to it and say, look, I've noticed these comments while I was reviewing the document. I don't care that strongly if you address them. They're just sort of suggestions to the authors and the working group as to how you might improve the document. And it's up to you to either take those on board or say, actually, no, I think the document's correct as it is. So we go through this balloting procedure, and eventually it resolves pretty much normally. After the discuss has been resolved, the document then gets published or goes into the RFC editor queue. It's worth knowing that also during every 2 weeks, as I said in here, they have these meetings where they do these document reviews. They're called the telechats. Those are open meetings. Anyone can go along to those meetings and listen into what they're saying and listening into the ADs and how they're reviewing. Anyone can see how the ADs are balloting on these documents. All this is done in the open and in the public. But you can't comment in those meetings unless you're invited to by the IESG. So sometimes the authors are invited to come along to the meeting, and if there's some particularly contentious issue, they'll invite the author to speak about and talk about it. Because again, the job of the area directors is not to try and stop your work from getting published, is trying to make sure that all the RFCs get published are published to a high standard. So they're there to help, not to cause you problems. The last comment on here is the ISG members or the area directors are really busy during the IETF week and the week running up to it. So you might find them around. They'll all have their yellow tags, yellow dots on their badges and things. And do feel free to stop them, but they may be in a rush. They may say, look, I might want to talk to you later, but they'll be rushing between meetings and rushing between working group sessions and trying to resolve all these issues, because that's what happens during these IETF weeks. They will also, or some of them hold office hours where they invite people to come in and sort of discuss particular issues with them. But in many cases, if you know which working group you're interested in, you might find that talking to the working group chairs is an easier avenue, because they'll be slightly less stressed and less busy during the week. Oh, hello. Yes. What's your question, please?
Hello, my name is Mushtaba. So I have two questions. First of all, if a working group rejects my draft, can I apply it for another working group?
So it depends. Normally, rather than it sort of rejecting the document and saying we won't accept it, normally before that happens, they will say this document isn't in the charter for the working group. So the charter is very specific for most working groups as to what's allowed or not. And the working group chairs will say to you, actually, this document isn't in charter. But they'll speak, they might be able to say, but you should take it to this other working group. We think that's where it's going to go. Often at that stage, the working group chairs would talk to the other working group chairs for the other working group and say, look, we've got this document. Do you think it fits in your charter? And there's that sort of discussion that goes on. Sometimes it might be that you need an area director's help to try and resolve where it should go. And it might be that the answer is this is a brand new, you've come up with a new replacement for BGP. And it might be that that is not something that you can just do in a working group. You need to have a bigger consensus check within the IETF. And there's a whole different process for how to do that. And Benoit will talk a bit more about bringing new work in. But so yes, you can take it to other working groups, but it's not really liked if you keep trying to take it to lots of different working groups.
Yes,
because they'll talk to each other.
Yeah, and my last question is, when an AD or like reject a draft or document and they want to discuss on something, is the author needs to fix the issue, or the working group would work on it?
Normally at that stage, it's the authors that help progress it, but the working group is copied into those discussions. So really the interaction is between the authors and the area directors, and the document shepherd is somebody that's helping, and the working group chairs may help resolve those issues rather than having the working group weighed in. But if the results of what was being proposed was incorrect, then you'd expect the working group members to say, no, I don't agree with this. But by and large, the working group's sort of done with the document, and it's really between the authors and the area directors at that stage, mostly in terms of how it works.
Thank you. I'm trying to understand, is it a kind of like maybe a discussion or a fight between the working group and the author, or is it a collaboration to fixing the issues in the document?
It's always better to try and think of it as a collaboration and
Think
things
of.
that, yes, but then there are sometimes you'll find everyone here is an individual, but there are sometimes you'll find that companies have particular views that they want something to be published or don't want to be published. So you get these choices where two different companies have two different competing solutions, and those can be quite acrimonious and things. And then it's up to the working group chairs and the area directors to try and make sure that everyone remembers that most people who come here, certainly people who come here for many, many years, we're all here to make the internet better, and we're all here to work collaboratively. And sometimes you have to say, actually, I'm going to back down and actually my protocol is not important enough that this is the one that has to be done this way. There's other solutions, and it's like give and take.
Thank you.
No problems. Thank you. How are we for time?
We're going to run over a little. That's okay.
Okay. Do I have a? There's somebody else on the queue as well.
Yeah, do we want to see if
Oh yes, Prasad.
Hi, this is Prasad. Rob and Benoit, this has been very helpful. I had a couple of questions. One is in terms of best practices that needs to be followed when it is in the ID phase, like an individual draft phase versus it's a working group document. What would you suggest the authors do differently? Because it seems like in both of them, it's about discussing it, getting consistency.
So there's a couple more slides at the end of this on suggestions, but for me, when people bring new work into the IETF, I always think it's more important to convince the working group there's a good problem to be solved and that there's a practical solution rather than trying to sell your specific solution. So I think that's number one, I think is useful. And two is don't try and bring a really long, complete document to the working group, because normally people want to develop it and expand it collaboratively. Whereas if you sort of bring a fait accompli and say, oh, here is my document and it's done, then it's harder to get people to review it. You know, if it's a 100-page document, there's a lot more impediment to people reviewing that. Whereas if it's a 10-page document or a 15-page document, then it's easier. And you don't, when you write those individual drafts, you don't have to have all the sections filled in. It doesn't have to be complete. You want to get the introduction to be good, and the explanation of the problem you're solving, focus on those, and you can work on the solution as you develop the document.
Thank you. And the other question I had was, if I have something which is kind of crossing the boundaries of working groups, like let's say security and grow working group, how does the process work? Like, do I start with grow and then maybe the working group kind of brings in the security people?
Yes, exactly. So you make a judgment as to which one is worth targeting, and when you write the name of the document, the draft name, you can make it turn up on the pages of one of those working groups. You may think, oh well, I think it should be grow, so you do that and you send it to grow, and then the grow chairs will then look at it and say, actually no, we think this should be under the security area. And so they will then talk to either a working group or they'll talk to their ADs or the SEC ADs, security ADs, and say, look, where should we take this document? So that's what discussion happens, and also whether the work is in scope for the IETF as well.
Thank you.
Right, Ben was up.
Deepak from Nokia. Quick question on something related to the previous question as well, on the classification of the documents, right? does experimental or informational require to be adopted by the group to evolve into an RFC, or is that optional?
It's required, except in one, just in ISC, but you're going to cover the ISC in a slide, right? So the answer is yes. Regardless of the Star Track information experimental, it has to be adopted by the working group, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, time to wrap up and bringing new work. We mentioned a lot of information, and I'm going to, on the next slide, cover just a couple of points, not read the entire slide. Okay, if you come to the IETF, you have to ask yourself, is this something that the IETF want to standardize? Typically, internet layer protocol or operational best practice. There are things that we don't do, like transmission hardware, for example, we don't do it. So the work that you're going to bring here, does it fit into this? Will it be used? And who is going to use it? Rob rightly mentioned, bring a problem on the table with the start of a solution. Then you will get people attention. And try to see who is interested to collaborate with you. I like very much the example of the 100-page document. It's not like a research paper that you publish here. It doesn't have to be complete. Bring the people with you. The last point, is this engineering or research? And yes, we need to do some research for future stuff. Did you hear about AI lately? Maybe, right? So the point is, what are we going to standardize in AI, if anything? That's why AI is mentioned in the IRTF. I guess you heard about that, the research part of the IETF. Okay, on the next slide. Okay, so we mentioned, write your draft. Even if you've got the brilliant idea, the fact to write it down, to structure it, to explain it to others is going to bring clarity. And that's how people are going to review it. For example, for me, I prefer to read a document and see exactly what you try to say. In a verbal communication, even slides, this is not clear. You might have a patent on your ID. This is fine. We're not in the business of telling if the patent is right or wrong. But the only condition is that you must disclose the patent whenever you have a draft. And specifically, whenever your document is about to become a group document, the chairs are going to ask you, do you know of any patent? And it doesn't go only to the authors, it goes to the entire working group. Because if there's a patent on encryption or whatever, and there are different ways to do patent with royalties or not, the working group might decide not to accept it. So we're not going to evaluate the patent, it's not our job, but we want to be aware of the patent if there is any. All right, so maybe the next slide, yeah. Choose your path. We discussed the appropriate working group. You must know which one you target. If you're not sure, take it to the dispatch group, because maybe as one of the last questions, it's about security and routing. So if you're not sure, you could go to dispatch or just get an email to both area directors or to the workgroup chairs. Forming a community of interested participants. That's also why coming to the hackathon and discussing with people, this is what I'm implementing right now. That will bring you potentially a community of people. There is something that could be done. You could request it to the area director. Let's assume that you want to do something new about security and BGP and BMP. If there is enough interest, if there is enough discussion, you could request a bird of a feather, which is like not the working group, this is pre-working group creation. We're going to discuss and see if there is a good problem to be solved for the community. If there is a community wants to work on this, if there is a good chance of success, and then maybe a working group will be created. The last question was about experimental information and should they always be working group document. There is like an extra pass, which is called the independent stream. That's a way to publish a document which is not specifically accepted by a working group. In my world, I had an RFC about NetFlow, whatever it is. It was a proprietary protocol, and I had a way to say to the community, this is how NetFlow is done. At the same time, we had the working group telling, now this is going to be the consensus-driven way of doing NetFlow. It's going to be called IPFix. But this is a typical case you could be telling, you could be using the independent stream. And on the next slide, and I believe the last one, how to be successful. Okay, write your draft. Prepare a short, accessible presentation. As we say in English, the 2 minutes elevator pitch. If I ask you, what's this about? And I need a drink to understand it because it's going to take 2 hours. Maybe there is something wrong. People are pretty busy here. Be prepared for the quick conversation. Socialize your idea. You will not succeed alone in the IETF. You need to get like buy-in from people, discussion, and sometimes something which is useful, people disagreeing with you, which is healthy. That's why sometimes people say it takes time at the IETF, but the number of reviews from different people, this is the key to the success of the IETF. Present if you want the hot RFC. You've got a few minutes to present your idea. And be aware that in the working groups are busy. So getting the airtime is difficult. And remember the priorities. First, working group documents. Second, the individual draft on which there is discussion already. So if you come last and just telling, hey, I've got this new idea I posted last week and I want 20 minutes, it might not be happening. And respond positively to feedback, always. So we want to leave you with this last slide. Is there anything you want to add, Rob?
The only one I want to add or re-emphasize is again is the presentations, because often you see that when somebody comes to present and they're new to IETF, they'll have like 10 slides and there's a huge amount of detail on those slides, but probably they'll only have a 5-minute slot at the end of the meeting to present. So you've got to get your idea across in a small number of slides and a small number of words, and just to get the people interested in what you're trying to solve and to know there's a solution. So that's the key bit. Don't give, because the draft has all the information in anyway. At this point, is there any questions for either of us? I can put up the last one. Is just a reminder of the process, I think. Yeah. I mean, actually, I've got just to say there is a slide in here that I missed because of the technical issues, discussing the choices between the different documents. So the key ones are effectively you get a proposed standard. That's like a proper standard that we're producing. That's part of the standards process. There's also one called Internet Standard, IS, but nobody really, or there's very few documents that reach that stage, so you sort of ignore them. So there's a proposed standard, there's informational documents. They used to have less consensus, but they still have the same consensus now. And those are ones that normally aren't protocols. They're ones that sort of give you some architecture documents maybe, or some use cases or other helping documents around there. Somebody mentioned experimental documents, experimental RFCs. You don't see many of those. Normally those are meant to be documenting an experiment that runs over a period of time with some set outcomes. And then after that, the experiment's completed and either you go and update it and produce a standards track document, or you say, no, the experiment's done and completed. And then the last thing that you'll see is BCP, best current practice. And these fall into 2 categories. So you get BCPs that cover IETF process. So RFC 2026 is part of BCP 14, maybe. Can't remember the number of it. So it describes the IETF process. And then you also get BCPs that actually sound more what they're like, which is like, this is the best industry practice. So there'll be a BCP on what security protocols, what version of TLS should we deploy now? You know, you should use TLS 1.2, you may use TLS 1.3, you have to stop using TLS 1.1. So there's like the internet community is saying, this is what we recommend you do if you're deploying this technology.
Okay, thank you, Rob and Benoit. That was a fantastic session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, everybody, we are going to do just a very quick few minutes turn over to the next presentation. And this is going to be a short presentation with an introduction to the hackathon, and then we'll break for lunch. So if you need a couple minutes, just come back quickly because we're going to try to get back on schedule.
I just put myself in the queue for a question/comment here, which was that a lot of this seems to have been about individual drafts written by individuals. A lot of the most successful documents I've seen at IETF have had multiple editors on the document, and it's not so much I had an idea, it is I talked with some other people and we came up with an idea and advancing it together. You're in it for a few years. If you bring a draft to IETF, you've got a few years time to progress this all to the end, and you're around for that time. So finding someone to work on it together with rather than doing it all by yourself is a great idea.
Absolutely, Bron's spot on with that comment. And again, it's worth saying within a working group, if you can see there's multiple people that are interested in working on that document and there's collaboration there, then the working group is going to have more interest than if it's one individual potentially who's like, this is my idea on my own. And it shows you're willing to sort of morph your ideas and take other people's views on board as well. Prasad.
Yeah, just a quick clarification on the terminology. Like when you say working group, is it everybody on the mailer? Like who represents the working group?
I'm not sure that's really well defined. So it's the collection of people who are interested in that problem. So it'll be the people who either turn up in the room in the meetings on the day, who might not all be on the mailing list. It'll be the people on the mailing list who are subscribed when you're discussing things over email. It might be people who are tracking the GitHub issues but aren't on the mailing list. So it's the set of people who are interested in solving that problem, and they come in different angles.
All right, thank you. We'll be back in just 2 minutes.